Welcome to Can I Get a Retake, where education meets innovation. Every month, we host conversations with the thinkers, teachers, and researchers shaping the world around us. We hope you tune in, get inspired, and join the conversation.
Diane, let's just start with an introduction. And could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what your role is at the College of Southern Nevada?
Sure. Well, my name is Diane Hardgrave, and I'm a tenured professor at the College of Southern Nevada. And I'm a medical anthropologist. And so the courses that I offer are medical anthropology and also some other general courses like biological anthropology. But this has really been the culmination of previous years of working overseas and just seeing so many different aspects of humanity. And it just had a really powerful effect on me. And that really provided the trajectory for me to focus specifically on biological anthropology and then my specialization of medical anthropology.
Wow. So, Michelle and I had a little conversation beforehand, getting our notes together, and realized that she and I are coming at this with two very unique perspectives. One, I don't have any background whatsoever in anthropology. I was a marketing major way back when, and Michelle was actually a major in anthropology.
Back in the day, yeah.
So, for the folks out there in the audience that are like me and new to the field, could you define what medical anthropology is and what a medical anthropologist does?
Yes. First, let me define anthropology because a lot of times there's a lot of confusion. Anthropology as a discipline is the study of humankind, what in all places across time. So anything that humans are getting up to, what they're doing, either in the past or in the present. So if you're studying the species, this is a really broad field. In terms of medical anthropology, there are four subsections of the discipline of anthropology. There's cultural, which most people are familiar with. There's biological, there's linguistics, and there's archaeology. Cultural anthropology looks at how people behave, what they're doing. Biological anthropology looks at people through a biological lens. So everything about our physicality, from genetics to growth and development. Medical anthropology cuts across those two disciplines. So if you're a medical anthropologist, you have a foot in cultural anthropology, and you also have a foot in biological anthropology, but it can also cut across linguistics and archaeology. But you're trying to understand what it means to be human by looking at how humans interact with their own biological health. What's the relationship between them as biological or organisms and things that might influence or enhance health? But there are also non-biological factors that influence human health. So this is sort of the starting point for medical anthropology. And then depending on your interest or your research, you have some medical anthropologists that focus more on all of the social and political determinants of health, access, quality of healthcare. And then you have medical anthropologists that swing to the other end of this perspective, and they're looking at gene frequencies within a particular population. So why, as an example, why would a certain population have a resistance to a particular disease and have a genetic propensity to resist that compared to others? So again, it's still really broad, but you can really sort of narrow down into very specific areas. And I'm biased, but
In one of your answers, you did give kind of a sneak peek into your vast experience working in the Peace Corps and working with Save the Children and how that kind of led to you going into anthropology or following it further, can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what led you to medical anthropology specifically?
Yeah, I can tell you this is kind of a great story. It's actually, I think it's in the first chapter where I share part of the story. Uh, when I was in the Peace Corps, you have a lot of training and orientation about how to keep yourself healthy because, we're moving to the tropics. And so there's a whole host of other pathogens that you want to make sure you're protecting yourself from. And I got sick with malaria.
Oh,
And I was doing everything you're supposed to do to prevent yourself from getting that. But there were breakthrough cases. But at that time, I was in a very remote rural village. I was only supposed to be there for a short period of time. And the family I was staying with, they were like, don't worry, we're going to take care of you. And this woman was making this tea. It had a very pungent smell. And she says, and I felt horrible. And she said, don't worry. She says, I know you've never had malaria before. And the truth be told, this was not the first time I had it. I had had it about 6 months ago, but it was a very mild case. And I said, well, actually, I did have it once before. She turned around and looked at me and she got so indignant. She goes, you've had malaria before? And she threw the tea out. And she's like huffing. She goes, well, you're really healthy. So now I have to make a different tea. And I remember thinking, I'm feeling that healthy. But what I came to understand was their definition of health was not the absence of illness or a disease, it's the successful overcoming. Healthy people are going to get sick, but they're going to overcome, they're going to survive it. And the fact that there was a whole matrix of personal experience that factored into how, in this case, they were considering whether I was healthy or not, and that determined the treatment that they were going to provide for me. So this really got my curiosity. And so for the rest of the time in the Peace Corps, I would ask about this disease or how do you handle this or what. And it was fascinating to me. And I understood that there were so many different perspectives of health other than the one that I was enculturated into when I was. So, that's a great example. Within my own family, there were a lot of remedies that at the time were relegated into folk melodies. But I started to realize there's a full wealth of knowledge about the body and about ways that you can treat the body or heal the body, attitudes, perspectives, that's just, it's so diverse. And, but yeah, it was amazing. It was not a Western treatment at all.
and as evidenced by you being here today, it was successful.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was the other thing about that story was that during that time when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, you were really discouraged from using any other what they said local treatments, if you're sick, and so I remember being a little nervous. It's like, well, am I going to get in trouble because basically I'm using this other form, this traditional medicine or tea, and well, I just didn't tell them. Of course, they might know I'm telling them now, but that's okay. It's many years. But yeah, so again, this fact that, okay, we're liable from a Peace Corps perspective, we're liable for our volunteers. So it's not necessarily a judgment against traditional medicine, but we don't want to get into the weeds about a treatment that we're not familiar with. So even that was sort of teasing me into all of the other things that can affect how people go about getting better and how that's viewed through different lenses.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned from your experiences in East Africa?
That would be a podcast series. What was curious to me, and this really started in Somalia, was the way health and attitudes and health knowledge is integrated into every other aspect of the culture. Now, for anthropologists, this is not a surprise, but it was very curious to me because you could be ill. For example, I remember in Somalia, some of the staff that I was working with, I'd say, "Oh, I don't really feel that well today." I was like, "I think it's malaria," or I think, and they're coming to work the way we would go to work with maybe a fresh cold. And when I would talk to them about it, they said, "Well, this happens. We have ways of treating this. This is no big thing." Um, in another situation, and this was at a time when there was just a lot of prevalence of HIV, positive HIV individuals, but it was still at a time when it was considered only certain people get AIDS, And so here you have a female that's married, only has had one husband, presumably one sexual partner, and she's HIV positive, and she told this to me. And I said, "Well, what are you going to do?" She was like, "Oh, this thing, we can get rid of it. I'm going to be okay." But that example is really powerful because the late and much missed Paul Farmer, who's a medical anthropologist, but also a physician, talks about in Haiti how women were showing up HIV positive, particularly those married to soldiers or truck drivers. And the reason for that is their husbands, if they're gone for a long time, they might take another temporary partner, and they're bringing this home to their wives. And so this is a much bigger cultural situation. And so it was just it just brought this further. Like there's so many other things. It's not just about what your biology is doing. One of the things that I say repeatedly to my students is that you're more than your biology. There's an example in one of the chapters where I say, if the three of us here got tuberculosis, we would all have the same treatment protocol. There's a protocol for treating tuberculosis, but we would not have the same experience, the same lived experience of tuberculosis. If you're having to stay, somebody might have to stay home from work. If they're the main breadwinner, this is a whole other situation. So that experience, and sometimes the lived experience of a disease, even though it's the same disease biologically for all of those individuals, so many other factors can affect how they respond to treatment and or even the length of the treatment. So these are some of the things that just through talking with people and also some experiences that I observed, that it kept on coming back. It just kept on circling back around, and this was amazing to me.
So, are there some threads or truth about human health and healing that you've noticed are consistent across your research?
That is such an anthropological. Well, the first thing I think I would say is, regardless of where you are on the planet, we want the same things. We want to be healthy. We want to live productive lives. We want to do that, and we just have different cultures and different populations have different ways of contextualizing it. But the bottom line is that nobody wants to be sick. Nobody wants to be ill. That's a sort of a departure from the main goal, which is to have a good life and to, as we say in North America, to just conduct yourself in a good way, from an indigenous perspective. And so that's the common theme. One of the reasons why we see variation with that is for a lot of traditional treatments that are plant-based, if a particular plant isn't growing in that region, then another region, there may be another plant that's doing something the same. So we see that variation. And this is a common thing, the relationship between your body, your family, your environment, your attitude, or your relationship with the unseen, which can be anything from a belief system or that culture's spiritual landscape. All of that comes into play. And for many cultures, it's not just body, mind, and spirit. For example, when I was in New Zealand, it was body, mind, spirit, family, education, and land. And an imbalance of any of those was a problem. So that is really common. And it's ironic in some ways because most indigenous cultures do not stop their perception of the body with the biological body. It extends beyond that. That's something we don't really see in the biomedical system that most of us are familiar with.
I am interested in kind of the nitty gritty, and that is when you're doing and going about, how are you conducting your research? Are there any particular methodologies or practices that you really rely on when you're in the field?
I'm very chatty. I know it's not necessarily listed as an ethnographic method, and my research is rooted in that in terms of just basic ethnographic tools. But what I have found, and at least this is just for me, is some of the most profound information or data that was shared with me has been on train rides, on the bus, just generally talking to people. And I found that just putting yourself in that context and having an open mind, it's almost as if people pick up on it. I'm going to go back to New Zealand as an example. So I was taking a bus in the Northland, and I was headed up to a place called Whangarei. And this old woman got on the bus a few stops after me, and this is a bus ride that's a few hours from Auckland. And we just started talking. And she was just going on and on all of this different thing. And I asked her, I said, if I wanted to talk about this to my students, are you okay with that? And there's a protocol for getting consent and what level of anonymity she was comfortable with. But yeah, and so I just find that has been for me the most effective way. It's almost as if a channel is just open. I will also say that in a lot of the places that I've been, particularly East Africa and New Zealand, and most people are not quite sure exactly what I am. And so, but I'm often not perceived as foreign. I mean that differently from being perceived as a foreigner, but I'm not always perceived as foreign. And so sometimes they'll get into a really big discussion about my ancestry and what they're pretty sure. This is another story I'll share. I don't know if you want to use this, but it's hilarious. This is in Ethiopia, and I had been up country, and this is at a time when I was working with Save the Children, and we had done some preliminary research in the northern part of Ethiopia to determine if we needed to extend some of our programs. So I've been on the road for a while and came back to the capital city, Addis Ababa, and most places, most hotels, places, even sometimes homes, they're thermally heated just because of the land there. And so you can have a sauna. Saunas are really common. And there's a lot of natural saunas that are accessible as well. But I was in a hotel and I just wanted to have a sauna, and I was in there with about 4 or 5 other Ethiopian women, and they clearly knew each other. They were talking, and I don't speak Amharic, and I know like 2 or 3 words. And so I came in and sat down, and they're talking, and I'm quite happy not to be involved. And the conversation got a little bit more intense. And then one of them elbowed, and I kind of jumped, and she kind of like spoke to me kind of harshly. in Amharic. And I said, I'm sorry. I said, I don't understand. And they were all shocked. And they're like, you're not Ethiopian? I'm like, no. And then a whole conversation ensued where one of them said, your father's Ethiopian, but your mother's American. And I said, no, no. And it's like, yeah, she's from Sudan. I mean, and I had a hard time when I finally told them the breakdown of my ancestry. They were like, you see, when you get all these different people together and they get married and have children, you get Ethiopian, you know. It's just so funny. But I mention that because I also know that depending on where I am, that often just gives me people are a little bit more comfortable sometimes talking with me because I might look a little bit similar to them. And so that's always I don't know, it's my anthropological superpower. As long as I stay in those regions, it's not going to help me in Ireland.
I don't know. Doesn't President Obama have a little bit of?
Yeah,
I mean,
kind of a
history goes
melting pot.
back. Yeah, it is a melting pot. Girl.
Ironically, I have more than 40% Irish ancestry genetically.
That's incredible. If you feel comfortable as a descendant of the Shinnecock Nation, how has your heritage kind of informed your views on healing and the ethics of care?
I am comfortable with this, but I need to say a caveat. So
Mm-hmm.
I am not a tribal member, which is why I use the word descendant. But growing up, this is what in New York, I was born and raised in New York, on Long Island. And we spent a lot of time there's a small reservation, Shinnecock Reservation. We spent a lot of time going to the powwows, going to different things, but it wasn't at least with my parents, it wasn't necessarily the main identity, but it was this knowledge that, you know, we come from, a lot of your family comes from this particular group, the Shinnecock. There are multiple indigenous tribes that were on Long Island, and so it's kind of very complicated. But what I remember is this notion about what happens in the ocean affects you on land. So the Shinnecock are known for their knowledge of whaling. When Dutch settlers came, they recognized the expertise of the Shinnecock in terms of whales. And I mean, that eventually led to a less desirable situation. But also, the Shinnecock are known for their work with wampum beads, those sort of lavender and white shells. And so these things were just woven into my childhood. But we spent most of our time as a family on the beach having clam bakes in the sand. I didn't know that we were doing that in a traditional way. It wasn't presented as that. That's just how we did it. So it really wasn't until I was an adult looking back and I'm saying, oh my gosh, we were doing this, or oh, that's why we used to go to Sag Harbor all the time, realizing that there was history there and connection. But for my family, it's just, for my parents, that's just what you did. That's where you went. There wasn't that kind of discussion about these are your ancestors and this is what they did, but there was still that connection. So as I got older then, I found myself wanting to honor that. I feel like my African ancestors, they got a good chunk of my life. All of those years, just about a decade. And I feel like my European ancestors have gotten a lot of my attention. But this one area, it's like, well, now I really want to honor that. So that's what's been driving me as an adult. And to some degree, the intention of wanting to honor them might just be enough. I mean, I know a few words in Shinnecock. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing them correctly. But yeah, and so that's how that fits in. But it also makes me sensitive to indigenous cultures elsewhere. Within the American Anthropological Association, there is a subsection that I belong to of indigenous anthropologists. And this is important because, anthropology doesn't, historically, doesn't have a really good reputation. And just because of their behavior and their treatment of the very people that they're studying. So the fact that there is just a growing population of indigenous anthropologists, which are just sort of presenting that perspective, is really important. And so I'm a member of that and try to do my little part to uh, present indigenous cultures to my students in a way that's not based on colonial perspectives. And yeah, that's my way of trying to address it.
That was always a struggle that I had, understanding the colonial, the racist roots of some of the earliest, famous anthropologists, and trying to reconcile how we can make anthropology a force for good and a force for healing.
Yes, absolutely. 2, 3 summers ago, I think it was 3 summers ago, there's a Hopi elder I was traveling with, and she wanted to go to her, they have a traditional home, like a ceremonial home, and I wasn't working. We were just traveling together. She goes, "Oh, I just want to stop by, I just want to go to this mesa," and it still didn't connect with me. And then all of a sudden she goes, "Well, that's Walpi, so we could just walk over there." And Walpi is like this really well-known Hopi village on top of this mesa that goes back. There are so many like old ancient sort of ethnographic reports, and I just remember I'm like, that won't be like I started to like shut down because I couldn't, and I realized that while I knew a lot about Walpi enough to recognize, I remember reading that when I was a student, I also realized that I really didn't know it from her perspective. And she's like, "Well, are you gonna stand there or are you gonna walk with me?" I was like, but yeah, and so seeing it from her perspective instead of, sort of going through the ethnographic record in my brain about Walpi and this is what has happened. It's still there. There are people that still live there. I became more interested in that and tried to calm myself. I was a bit of an anthropological groupie there for a couple of minutes.
You've studied how Western health practices are perceived in the US. So, what are some of the common misperceptions that you run into? And when you're teaching, how do you help the students or even your colleagues think about them?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that one.
Mm-hmm.
What I do in my medical anthropology course is I try to remove myself from the perspective of preaching. What's going on? You think, there's this. So I want to expose them to all of these different healing traditions and all of these different perspectives without necessarily seeming like I'm really coming down hard on biomedicine or that I have a particular preference or bias. One of the ways I do that, and this is a very well-known book by Anne Fadiman called The Spirit Catches You When You Fall Down. And it's the story of a Hmong family that has a daughter, Leah, who is having seizures. So from a biomedical perspective, she has epilepsy. And this, of course, is quite serious. From the Hmong perspective, while they recognize that there's a danger within their culture, they also have a spiritual context for this. That oftentimes people that are chosen to be shamans, traditional healers, have some type of healing crisis. And their ability to navigate that becomes synonymous with their ability and their effectiveness as a shaman. So the book is really about this family that's in California, and the daughter, Leah, has been taken to Mercy Hospital, and this clash between the hospital physicians, nurses, and staff, and this Hmong family, but not so much the family, really the culture. And what happens is, at the beginning of the semester, as students are reading this, they're very ethnocentric. So they're like, well, Leah's parents, they don't speak English. They don't really understand that their daughter has epilepsy and something needs to be. So they really sort of start off like that. And somewhere around around after the midterm, and this is just a post time, it's not anything specific about the midterm exam, but about halfway through the semester, you start to see change. They start to shift, and it happens in their language, where now in the beginning they're so sure they know about what would be the right thing for Leah. And then their language starts to change. It's like, well, maybe if there was just a way for, are there any Hmong doctors at the hospital? Or maybe if there is a way to communicate. And I always say I want to use a different book, a different reader. But it's really hard for me to come away from that because I see that journey that they're on. So I don't have to really tell them anything. They come to that realization themselves, which I think is much more effective as a professor. And they get to put that wherever they are. Was it the last Summer Olympics? Suni Lee, who is a gymnast who is Hmong, and I had so many students emailing me like, Suni Lee's Hmong, and did you see that picture when she won? They said this is her family, and they were 50 people. And now I remember how they have this extended family, and they're starting to make connections. And these are not students that I currently have. These are students that took the course, previously. So when I see that, I'm like, yeah, I did my job, because they're carrying that over. So where I can, I try to present content and generate discussion that allows students to sort of explore and sort of think about things in a different way than perhaps they would have thought prior to taking the course.
Sure. Figure it out for themselves.
Yeah.
Speaking
And of course,
of
my story is like the one I shared with you about the malaria. I mean, there are some other stories in my book, and they're all at my expense. But it's, just to sort of open an aperture of curiosity.
Would you say that when you were writing your text with GRL, that it allowed you to view your own research or your own work in a different way?
Yes. And one of the reasons for that is because the way the text is presented and just the way GRL functions, I can update it really easily. I can shift it. I can tailor it. And what that allows me to do is not only keep the material relevant, but it allows me to say, how can I take this experience and present it a different way? Sometimes I go back to my journals from back then, and I'm looking for different examples. And that's really why I have appreciated working with GRL in the context of this text, because I'm like, oh, this isn't really working anymore. I want to change this. I can do that. It's not having to rewrite the entire text over.
You did mention kind of the methods in which you present to your students, but you've also had experience talking in front of the United Nations. What was that experience like, and what did you want policymakers to walk away understanding?
So that particular event, during that time, and this was in the 90s, the UN was really dealing with globally an unprecedented amount of refugee populations all over the world. And so there was a discussion about, there is a part of the United Nations, the UN, United Nations High Commission for refugees, UNHCR. And so there was a lot of discussion about policies or what to do because it wasn't just one sort of crisis and you had a large refugee populations. It was in Asia, it was in Africa, it was in all of these different regions. And so that was the premise for this particular conference and this gathering. So myself representing Save the Children at the time, the International Red Cross, and Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Now, I was in Somalia and I had come back to the States for just leave. And what was common at the time was if people that had been working in the field would come back, the PR department might set up an interview with like NPR. Or, they might just do something, particularly if you're coming from a place that had been in the news a lot. And so Somalia, all of East Africa was just all over the news. And so I was told by our PR people, they said, there's a meeting that's going to be held at the United Nations. And they are looking for somebody from Save the Children to talk about their programs there and about this. And when I got there, this was an entirely different situation. And I was like, oh, so you walk into this room, there's like all the seats, and you're on stage. So I didn't have time to get nervous, but I was blown away. And the advantage of that for me was my two other panelists were talking about programs that could be done, what they were doing and what programs that could be done. And I just off the cuff realized that what nobody was talking about was the culture and the values and the lives of the refugees. This idea that, okay, they've left one region where they were marginalized or they were in danger, and they've come to this place. So they've got their basic needs. It's a city of tents, but they've got food, they've got water, they've got health, but it's still a pause in their lives. Mm-hmm. And so I started to talk about the role of culture and understanding culture when coming up with refugee program policies. To understand that there may be cultural core values that could assist. And, and I gave some examples, please don't ask me what they were now, but, I gave some examples of how the culture and the lived experiences of the refugees can actually be a resource for these programs. And it's going to allow a much greater integration because you don't know what's going to happen afterwards. After they're not labeled as refugees, then what? And so I have no problems talking. You might have picked that up. But that particular experience, I think the reason why I seemed so calm externally was because I really didn't realize it was going to be something like this big. I thought it was going to be like a little conference room with 12 people, and we were just going to talk. I didn't realize it was going to be that big of a thing. I do have a picture. But I also feel that it was significant because I could look up and I could see this row of windows. And that's where if you do a tour of the UN, you can go and I remember being a child with my mom on tour and looking down. It's like, oh, that's Russians. And now I'm like on the stage or at the podium, looking up, and that was surreal.
So after you spoke there, what did you hope that the policymakers that you spoke to, what did you hope that they were going to take away from what you spoke about?
I hoped that they would find ways of bringing refugees into the conversation about policy.
Are there any particular ethical responsibilities when you're working as a medical anthropologist and you're working with communities that are displaced or marginalized that you want to make sure you're following so that you are bringing their voice and amplifying their voice more so than your own biases or perceptions?
Well, that's standard Anthropological Protocol 101 is that you have a moral and ethical responsibility to the people that you're interacting with. And communication and transparency is, in my opinion, the best way to do that. You also have to do a little bit of homework because in a lot of the places that I've been, you have more than one ethnic group, of which their relationships with each other might be really good, or there might be some tension there. So you do have to understand if you're in a particular region with one ethnic group and you have an informer or support staff from another, you need to understand that that might affect how, what kind of responses you get. Toward that end, there was a rapid rural research project that I was engaged in Ethiopia. This is the one prior to my sauna experience. And it was myself and another gentleman, a Canadian national. And we were in the Awash Valley of Ethiopia at this particular time. The ethnic group was the Afar, who, from an Ethiopia perspective, most anthropologists know about the Afar and the Awash Valley in terms of Australopithecus, Afarensis, and discovered. So the gentleman was talking to the males about food security, and this was a region that was like getting emergency response food. And the intent was to see if Save the Children needed to bring in more food. Did they need to change the program? And so I was hanging out with the women. And as soon as the men sort of went off to have the conversation, all of a sudden here the headdresses, the veils come off. They're making coffee with cardamom and ginger. That was really good. And they start talking. And what was discovered was at the time, wheat was being brought in as the grain, the food. And they said, wheat is easier to prepare, but we don't really like it. Kind of hurts our stomach. So we usually sell it to buy sorghum. But they're just talking and they're saying things like, the men are like, oh yeah, let's get more wheat and it's going to be easier for us to make. Sorghum is a lot more labor intensive. You have to grind it first. And so then when I reported this back, it was like, wait, what? They prefer sorghum. Nobody asked them their preference.
Didn't go to the source, to the person who's actually preparing it.
And so, and from that, we actually, the proposal was then put forth to bring sorghum in, which is also abundant at that time in the States. So it wasn't, from that perspective, wheat, sorghum, it didn't really matter. But here it was. We also found out that wheat was being it had become a kind of currency where everybody's trading it to get the things they want. But nobody was really all that excited about eating it, which is a problem in, an emergency food program.
Correct.
Yeah. And so but having that, in terms of my methods and ethics, just listening, not assuming you know anything. That's and I know there are many different ways of doing that, and my colleagues have many different methods. And you find out what works for you and what you're comfortable with. But the bottom line is you need to be transparent, you need to have consent, you need to be respectful, and that's the ethical foundation from which you work on as an anthropologist. And particularly going back to your earlier question, because this is not something that happened in the early days of anthropology, where it was just gather the data and also some artifacts and leave.
Nope.
Well, I think I can speak for Michelle, and we both picked up very much so on your passion for what you do. And you've said that you fell in love with humanity through your work. So can you explain a little bit more about what that phrase means to you, and how does it show up in your teaching and your research?
There have been so many different experiences that have left me awestruck, whether it's, the mother that was really angry because I had malaria but was healthy. And the fact that she even she had other things to do, But there she is taking care of me because I'm in the village and I'm staying at her house. This is extraordinary to me. I have been traveling in places where the roads are closed or they're washed out, and whether it's a bus driver or somebody on the little bus or van, they were like, come stay at my house. And and now this is a big thing, and they're killing a chicken and they're making this dinner. This is, you don't see this in the States in the same way. And that's, not to say it doesn't happen, but I also think in a lot of rural areas in the States, there is that kind of um, uh, cultural tendency, just like, oh, let's help, we'll share what we have. But this was something that was common and that I experienced over and over, and I was amazed. And so there you are in some remote place eating a meal that was prepared simply because you're there. And they're talking, and there's kids climbing all over you. And it wasn't something that was specific to a particular culture or a particular country. And yeah, I mean, it's how I believe most people want to be anyway. But this was amazing, and that it transcended culture, it transcended age, it transcended gender, it just didn't matter. And so this was phenomenal. And all of this against the backdrop of some just extraordinarily beautiful landscapes and environment. I mean, you can't help but just fall in love with the whole thing.
Yeah, you truly get to see the beauty that's in humanity and how we all, at the end of the day, just want to help each other, have that hospitality culture.
Yeah. And so I think this translates into my teaching because I do tell a lot of stories. Particularly in my 101 class. I mean, I have unfortunately a story for almost every chapter, and it's usually comical, again, at my expense, but in the telling of that story and stuff, it's now not something you're reading in a textbook. Now it's, hey, this is what happened to me, and it's almost got that same flavor as when you've been invited into someone's home in the middle of nowhere. You're sharing a meal and you're just talking. And I do get feedback from students in terms of my reviews, but with other types of feedback, that's what draws them in, that they get drawn into the story. And now I've got it, and then they remember the story, may not remember what they read in a particular section of the chapter, but then they can extrapolate that out from the story. And so it keeps those stories alive, and it allows them to sort of have their own relationship with the content.
In our research, we learned about the anthropology lab that was developed, or that you developed at College of Southern Nevada. Can you tell us about the kinds of experiences or tools that you want to offer the students there that maybe you didn't necessarily get early on in your career?
I was kind of lucky, but the lab, this is great because now I could just, the lab that you see here is for biological anthropology. One of the things students need to are introduced to is osteology, which is the study of the skeleton. And it's one thing to look at pictures. It's one thing to say, okay, there's 206 bones. But to hold a femur in your hand, now these are replicas, but there are other experiences off campus where students can actually handle actual skeletal remains. That's more in the forensics program. But to hold a femur and feel, just the ridges, those kinds of, you cannot teach that kind of tactile experience. And for a lot of students, they're not necessarily thinking about what's going on, the structure inside their body, unless they've had an injury. Some of the best students in archaeology are the ones that have had a broken bone or a knee injury or this, that, because then they kind of, they have a little bit more awareness of what's going on. The lab is meant to give students hands-on experience. So looking through a microscope and seeing different stages of mitosis or meiosis. We had an event when the lab was first opened where we wanted to swab. We wanted to offer it as a station. We had different stations where people could move through the lab, similar to what is set up now for a presentation, where you can't really see the Neanderthal skeleton, but there was one there. And they could pick it up and they could touch it. But we had this station that I was calling selfie, the selfie station, CELLFIE. So it could swab your cheek, put it on a slide, and you could look through the microscope. And I would set it up so I would isolate maybe just one of the cheek cells. And then we could take a picture of it and we would email it. So it was literally a selfie. But this idea of having them relate physically to a lot of the specimens that we have, a lot of the experiments. There's a great blood testing thing. It's not real blood, but they can determine like blood typing, whether it's A, B, O, AB. But it's because they're moving through and they're working individually. They're also working in groups. They get to understand this. There's 2 weeks of genetics where they're creating, base pairs that make a protein and understand what happens. It's just fascinating, and they love it. It meets a requirement. They do need to have a science lab for their general education, but they just have an amazing experience. And we try to, when I established it, I was just thinking in terms of some of the basics that we've had. And then I was able to access more funds, this, that, and the other. We just kept on adding specimens and equipment and measuring tools. And the lab is also linked to for a certificate of achievement in forensic anthropology. And this was for students that were interested in forensics. These are undergrads. And so they're interested in forensics, but they're not quite sure. They will have already had to take biological anthropology and this lab specifically, but then really delving into looking at skeletal pathology, being able to tell the difference between pathology and trauma. Bone characteristics throughout the course of life, from infant to juvenile to adult to seniors. And that goes in. So we have all of those specimens and instruments and tools for them to have that experience. And it's fabulous. It's probably, if somebody said, my time, I've been with College of Southern Nevada going on 14 years. If I had to point to something that is like what I think is the best that I've produced, it's this lab. And the amazing instructors that we have that are offering this. It's not just any instructor that can teach the lab. And we developed kind of a whole culture of how we can support students, really pique their curiosity and showcase them when they're doing presentations and really good work. And so it makes me really happy.
I think one of the last questions I really have is if you could offer any piece of advice to our listeners for improving their health and vitality that you've learned from your research and your experiences abroad.
I don't know if advice I would have, but I can tell you what I've learned. The human body is far more resilient than perhaps we think, and it can respond in a variety of different ways. And no matter what medical system you were raised or brought up in or enculturated in, if you can have an open mind to just looking at what other medical systems say about the same condition, just opening up to that, I think is very valuable. A personal example is that if I'm going to make something up. So if I have a really bad headache, I'm probably not going to take aspirin or ibuprofen right away. I may think about now what's going on, am I stressed, and sometimes I'll just play a game like, if I was an Ayurvedic practitioner, what would I say to get? But this idea that there are many different causes, and this is also just a result of being exposed to so many cultures where it's not just biology.
Mm-hmm.
And I have found oftentimes I can alleviate in this headache analogy or reduce it. That doesn't mean I won't take ibuprofen. Like if I had a really bad headache before this interview, I would have taken ibuprofen. I don't have time to figure out what the Ayurvedic idea is or what Chinese medicine is saying. I just need to be okay. But just being open to all of the other ways that humans on the planet treat illnesses. Also, the biomedical system is the youngest. It's the new kid on the block. You've got medical systems that are far older, 4,000, 7,000 years old, and those folks are still on the planet. So just open up a little bit to other medical systems and see how it resonates with you.
And it is kind of in alignment with your current research, right? Kind of focusing on the shamanic healing narratives and other indigenous healing systems.
Yeah, so this notion of a lived experience of an illness is curious to me. And so shamanism, looking at different shamanic narratives, what are they seeing, experiencing? Are there commonalities? Are there common shapes, themes, colors? For about, I think, 6 years, I was the president of a subsection of the American Anthropological Association, and this was the Anthropology of Consciousness. And so a lot of this was being considered, but I always sort of looked at it from a perspective of health and healing. So I'm still collecting those, and this is probably going to be one of those long-term, lifetime research projects, but I do see some commonalities, and that's curious to me. I want to know, well, what's going on there? So you'll have to stay tuned for that. Maybe I'll come back to GRL and see if they want another book on it.
And we really appreciate your time with us today. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I hope that we can have you back in the future for sure.
Thank you.
Make sure to hit that notification bell after subscribing to our Great River Learning YouTube channel. Our mission is to inspire and educate those in higher education, one insightful conversation at a time. So until next time, thank you for watching and keep thinking beyond the book.